Hello and welcome to our webinar on self-stimulatory behaviour. My name is Lauren Chapman. I'm the Clinical Director at Woodbury Autism Education and Research. I have a Master's in Special Education and I'm a Board Certified Behaviour Analyst. So our aims for today, we're going to further analyse what self-stimulatory behaviour is. We're going to discuss considerations involved in selecting behaviours for targeted reduction. We're going to review relevant literature in how to reduce self-stimulation, and we're going to look at some case studies of successful intervention here at Woodbury. So let's start with what is self-stimulatory behaviour. If you Google self-stimulatory behaviour, the definitions you get up are repetitive and restrictive patterns of behaviour which serve no function or purpose. And also stereotypy or self-stimulatory behaviour refers to repetitive body movements or repetitive movement of objects. These movements are used solely to stimulate one's own senses. So one of the things that's always kind of struck me in this is behaviour, the fact that self-stimulatory behaviour is defined as a behaviour without function or purpose. Whereas as a behaviour analyst, we are taught and we know that all behaviours serve a purpose. All behaviours happen for a reason and all behaviours have some form of function. Whether or not these functions are appropriate or useful to the individual is different, but they actually do serve a function, they do serve a purpose. Self-stimulatory behaviour itself is part of typical childhood development. It's something that all children go through this stage in terms of their early development, and it is technically something that we all do. We all engage in some kind of self-stimulatory behaviour, whether it be flicking a pen or playing with our hair or twiddling our fingers, jiggling our legs when we're bored, doodling on a piece of paper when we're listening to a boring lecture. They're all forms of self-stimulatory behaviour. So to classify them all as unfunctional or have no purpose would be unfair. Self-stimulatory behaviour itself can have a useful function and a useful purpose, provided it's used in the right pattern or the right area or under the right circumstances. So if you look at self-stimulatory behaviour in relation to autism, self-stimulatory behaviour is more common in individuals with developmental disabilities and is most prevalent in people with autism spectrum disorders. If you look at the current DSM-5 definition of autism, repetitive restrictive behaviours are within the definition. It is a defining characteristic of autism. As I talked about earlier, the definition or the description of it as being a behaviour without function is something that I would disagree with. Most often, self-stimulatory behaviour does serve the function of automatic reinforcement. People engage in it because it has some form of internal feedback or pleasant sensation. But I also want you to consider, as we talk through these slides and through this discussion, that there may be other functions to this behaviour, and they don't always serve automatic reinforcement, but it does always serve some form of purpose. So then if you look at self-stimulatory behaviour, as I touched on it earlier, it is a normal developmental phase. It's something that young children go through in terms of their exploratory play and categorisation of the world. And it's typically something that is replaced with more advanced play and social skills as they develop. I remember as I became a new mum when my little boy started learning to play and explore the world, and I was really amazed at how many self-stimulatory behaviours he engaged in, that kind of repetitive motion, the repetitive hand flapping, lining things up. They were all part of the kind of typical development of him exploring the world. And as a behaviour analyst and a new mum, it was something I definitely overanalyzed and was really concerned about what it meant. But actually, as he developed, as he grew, he learned some more appropriate play skills, he learned some more appropriate social skills, and what looked like self-stimulatory behaviour did decrease. But I think it's important to remember for our children with autism, they don't necessarily move through this phase. They don't always learn the appropriate play skills or the appropriate social skills to replace the self-stimulatory behaviour. And as a result, self-stimulation often perseveres much longer than it would do in a typically developing peer. And it's this perseverance or this prolonged use of self-stimulation that is somewhat inappropriate. And then think about the fact that all behaviour is learned. Again, we know as a behaviour analyst that a behaviour is repeated because it's reinforced. If a behaviour continues to happen, it's because it's meeting some form of reinforcement and is serving some form of purpose or function. So when you think about self-stimulatory behaviours for our children with autism, they continue to engage in them because they're meeting some kind of reinforcing need. Either that be the internal sensation which they're seeking from it, maybe it's some kind of sensory regulation, possibly it's some kind of form of blocking out noise, blocking out attention, blocking out less preferred activities. It may be a way of self-calming or self-soothing or some form of self-management. Maybe it's a form of communication. Maybe it's a way of getting your wants and needs. So I'm going to talk a bit now about when we think about behaviours that we target for reduction. So as a behaviour analyst, one of our main aim is to target socially significant behaviours and to ensure that we are reducing behaviours that are socially significant and are important to the individual. In terms of self-stimulation, if you think of the social significance, you can argue for both ways. When you're looking at socially significant behaviours and reducing behaviours, often your first targets for reduction, those behaviours that pose a serious risk to self or serious risk to others, are really high in frequency or have some kind of other interfering nature. So often when you're looking at reducing target behaviours, children that are engaging in physical aggression, self-injury, property destruction, elopement, you're going to work on all of these behaviours before you even consider self-stimulation as being an important behaviour to reduce. But if you have a child who hasn't got any of those significant overt behaviours, then maybe self-stimulation is something you want to consider reducing. You want to consider the fact that it does impact an individual's ability to learn. By engaging in self-stimulation, you have less opportunity to engage with the world around you. You are less likely to engage in social interactions and learning opportunities. Self-stimulation itself is kind of all-encompassing. It really does disrupt a child's ability to attend to the environment around them, and will have an impact based on that on their ability to interact. It's also something that families often request. We have lots of IEP meetings where families will request and like to decrease self-stimulation. And the reason for these wishes are very varied. Sometimes it's because they engage in the behaviour in public and it draws attention to them, and it draws attention to the fact that they're different. Sometimes it's because engagement in the self-stim means that the parents find it difficult to interact with them and difficult to engage with them. Sometimes they find the self-stim interferes with family activities and that kind of thing. But there's a variety of different reasons. But it's often a valid request. Parents wish for their children to have a happy and normal life, and they feel that reducing self-stimulation is important. When this topic comes up with parents, it's something I often discuss with them in terms of the fact that it's really difficult to reduce self-stimulation completely. It serves a need, it meets a purpose, the child is doing it for a reason, and until that reason is met more appropriately, it's going to be very difficult to decrease the behaviour completely. In terms of interventions with self-stimulation, sometimes if you decrease or minimise one self-stim, the child will replace it with something else or something different. So if you're thinking about in terms of reducing self-stimulation, we've talked about the fact that it does impact learning and limited opportunities. It is distracting, it does minimise interaction with the world. But having said that, it's generally of no risk to self or others. And in some situations it can be useful. It can be used to improve focus, it can be used to self-calm, to regulate, to provide entertainment or something to do in times of downtime. I mean, even as I'm sat talking to you guys now, I'm swinging on my chair and flicking a pen. It's technically self-stimulation, but it's not stopping me from completing this lecture, it's not stopping me from talking to you, it's not interfering with what I'm doing. However, if you, as a person listening to the lecture or listening to the webinar, was engaging in that kind of self-stim, it may be impacting your ability to listen and to attend and to join in. So it's important to think that some kinds of self-stim may be appropriate in some situations, but not in others. When you think about reducing self-stim, it's a victimless behaviour. It's not something that's going to harm anyone. It's not going to cause any real damage to anyone. There are instances I've seen where self-stim can escalate to a form of self-injury. So you do need to be careful that some of these self-stims that are repetitively engaged in may result or may be associated with more serious behaviours. And if that's the case, obviously intervening in self-stim is important. If self-stimulation is occurring at a frequency that is impairing to other behaviours, to other participation, you'd want to consider putting it in. And also bearing in mind the fact that self-stimulation can be associated with other more serious behaviours. Like I said earlier, it can link or escalate to self-injury. Also, you can find that when you start to target behaviour such as self-stim for reduction, that it will result in more significant behaviours through your extinction burst. When you're trying to block engagement in the self-stim, you might find there's an increase in aggression or other kind of behaviours, and you want to consider this in terms of your planning and how you're going to intervene. So interventions for self-stimulatory behaviour. When you go through the research and the literature on how to intervene with self-stim, there are a variety of different principles out there and different interventions that can be applied to the principle of self-stim. You need to think about proactive strategies. So when you're decreasing any kind of target behaviour, you're looking at what you're going to replace the behaviour with, and maybe teaching some rules surrounding how to engage in the behaviour. So conditioned play is a really nice way of intervening on self-stimulatory behaviour. As we talked about earlier, engagement in self-stim can be a result of limited play skills. It's kind of associated with that developmental phase that the child has got stuck in, and by teaching some more appropriate play skills, you can decrease the engagement in self-stim. Another thing to think about when you're teaching appropriate play skills is if you can maybe transfer the stim to a more appropriate game or appropriate activity. There are some play activities that are very repetitive and that do kind of promote the engagement in self-stimulatory behaviours, but they're much more appropriate than doing the behaviour without the activity. So if you're thinking of stuff like sensory bins and rice and sand, or activities like ball drops that have the repetitive motion that go round and round, or even some of the iPad games that have the same kind of repetitive activity over and over again, all of these are much more appropriate ways for a child to engage in self-stim than just engaging in them by themselves. You want to think about functional communication. Is the engagement in self-stim due to a breakdown in communication? Is it maybe because the child can't express some internal sensations, or maybe they can't express some desires or wants or needs, and you can put some kind of appropriate communication in place for them to support it? Using any of the differential reinforcements, so differential reinforcement of alternative, incompatible or other behaviour, can be successful in decreasing self-stimulation while increasing appropriate alternatives. And also considering the access to behaviour as a reinforcement. So I touched on this earlier, but when you're intervening on self-stimulatory behaviour, it's somewhat unlikely that you're going to get it down to a level of 0, because the behaviour serves a need, it serves a purpose, and it's one of those behaviours that is very difficult to replace. We actually often do find that when you replace one self-stim or you decrease it to 0, the child will replace it with a different self-stim. And this is something you need to be really cautious in terms of intervention, that you want to make sure whatever the child selects for their own replacement is not going to be worse or pose a significant risk of harm to themselves, and you may have been better off not intervening in the first place. But you can use access to self-stimulation itself as a reinforcer, so teaching the child when it is appropriate to engage in the behaviour and when it is not, and then using that as a means of decreasing the engagement in self-stim during certain activities. Another thing you could consider in terms of intervening on self-stim is reactive measures, so how to prevent access to reinforcement. Now this one is really hard and often does involve some quite restrictive practices, simply because the nature of self-stimulation, if it's being engaged in for automatic reinforcement, the chances are the behaviour itself is reinforcing, and as soon as the individual engages in the behaviour, they've already come into contact with the reinforcement, and it can be really difficult to kind of break this pattern and to break this contingency. Some of the research out there suggests response blocking, response inhibition or redirection, but often you will find that you need to be quite physical and quite forceful in these applications in order to really stop the child from engaging in the behaviour. I remember we had one child I worked with previously who used to engage in, I can't remember how he did it, but he used to have cup his hands together in a kind of weird squelchy motion, and he would do it repeatedly all day, every day. So the response, what we did was we actually put in some gloves. He used to wear a pair of cotton gloves that prevented him from making that same squelchy sound and stopped him from engaging in that behaviour. But he did then transfer that behaviour to a different self-stim, which was, I can't remember what it was, but it was equally disruptive and equally high in intensity. And the reason he transferred that self-stim from one to the other was because we didn't teach any proactive strategies, we didn't teach any appropriate replacement or any appropriate alternatives to the behaviour, so he selected one for himself. And then finally, when you're thinking about self-stimulation and your intervention, you want to consider the function of behaviour. And is it always automatic? We often assume that self-stimulatory behaviour, based on the nature of it and how it looks, that it is being engaged in because it's automatically reinforced. And this probably is the case. Maybe you'll find there's almost always an element of automatic reinforcement, but I think it's important to remember that it's not always automatic reinforcement. Maybe the child is engaging in the behaviour to block something out, or to escape a less preferred activity, or to avoid doing something. Maybe they're engaging in the behaviour to get your attention, or to make a request, or to do something that they find difficult otherwise. So really thinking about why the behaviour is occurring, and that will help you on how to intervene. So we're going to talk through now some case studies on intervention on self-stim here at Woodbury, so you can get some idea of some of the interventions we've put in place and how successful they've been. This first case study here is on an 11-year-old girl. She is non-verbal, but she's a very proficient LAMP user. So LAMP is language acquisition and motor planning, and it's a form of AAC that she uses, and she can use this to create 3-4 word sentences, to make requests, to comment, to answer questions, and so on. Her target behaviour is vocal self-stim. She engages in loud humming noises, often accompanied with closed eyes and banging open palms on the table. And the function we thought initially was automatic. We took some ABC data and we assumed, based on the nature of the behaviour and the fact that it did occur across all settings, we saw it in work, we saw it in play, we saw it in preferred activities, we saw it when she was alone and when she was with people. We felt that it was functions automatic reinforcement, and we intervened based on this assumption. So why intervene? We talked earlier about selecting behaviours for target reduction and why you would assume, or why would you select self-stim as an appropriate behaviour to reduce. So for this specific child, she didn't have any other overt target behaviours. There were no instances of aggression or self-injury or any other extremely disruptive behaviours. So there was no other higher priorities that we needed to consider for her. But the behaviour was occurring at a really high frequency. And it was impacting her learning and impacting those around her, because it was very difficult to kind of block out and to work through it when the person next to her was engaging in really loud humming noise. It was also something her parents had asked us to work on. They had a new baby at home and they were concerned about her ability to interact with her new sibling based on the high engagement in self-stim. So we took some data just to see how often the behaviour was happening, and you can see here that about 30% of the time she would engage in learning activities without self-stim, but for about 65% of the time the self-stim actually disrupted her activities. And we defined this as when she was given a direct instruction, she didn't respond within 3 seconds because she was engaging in self-stim. So for 65% of the time her engagement in self-stim was actually preventing her from learning, and as a basis on this we decided it was important to intervene. So our initial intervention, we taught the FCT phrase of I need a break, not so much a break from work, but a break to allow her to access self-stim as a reinforcer. So we set up a specific break area that she could go to. It had a nice little pillow and a little box of stimmy things that she often used to engage in self-stim, and the idea was that she would make a request to go to that area whenever she needed to engage in self-stim. We put in some redirection procedures whereby if she engaged in self-stim outside of that area, we'd give her some incompatible tasks, prompt her to ask for a break and send her to the break area. The request to access self-stim or to teach when and where it was appropriate. We were not aiming to decrease the behaviour to 0, because it does serve a purpose for this child and is something she's likely to persist in or to engage in or replace with something else unless that need is met. But we did want to minimise this occurrence during social settings and work settings, and to teach her when and where it was appropriate to engage in. So we started with the request to access, and we plan to shape this into a set of rules. For example, you can go to your bedroom to engage in self-stim, or you can go to the quiet area to engage in self-stim, but you can't engage in it. At the dinner table, you can't engage in it during work times. We also taught her the receptive instruction of quiet mouth, because we felt that she didn't really have true control or understanding over the fact that she was engaging in the self-stimulatory behaviour. It seemed like such an automatic kind of reflex response that we weren't completely sure she even knew she was doing it at times, and she wasn't able to respond to the instruction when we told her to stop or to cease engagement in it. So we taught the instruction quiet mouth. We used a gesture prompt of fingers to lips, because we found that when she put her fingers to her lips, that did result in her briefly ceasing the behaviour, and then we could reinforce her for following the instruction quiet mouth. And the aim was that we would gradually shape this into her ceasing the behaviour for longer periods of time. After this initial intervention, we put in token economy, whereby she was reinforced using differential reinforcement for other behaviours. These include sitting in the chair, hands down, and quiet mouth. She was reinforced on a fixed ratio of 1 for every time she responded correctly to the instruction without engagement in self-stim. We also put in a visual schedule showing her when she had access to breaks and access to items that she could typically engage in. We did restrict access to some of her highly preferred items, specifically the iPad. We found that she engaged in large levels of self-stimulation with the iPad, and she wasn't playing with it appropriately. She was playing with it in a very restricted, repetitive manner, and that access to this item actually increased her level of self-stim rather than decreased it. So we restricted access to this and worked really hard on teaching her some more appropriate activities and appropriate play skills. And we did suggest that mum consult with an OT to see if there's any other recommendations they could make in terms of meeting her sensory needs and ensuring that she was getting appropriate access to the sensations and internal activities that she was seeking. So you can see here a review of our intervention, the data we collected. You can see there are 3 different types of data. We were actually only focusing on the humming in terms of our behaviour reduction, but we were tracking a few other behaviours as well, the picking of objects and the picking of skin. So the reason we picked the humming as the most important or the highest priority target was because it does happen most frequently and was also the most disruptive to her and to her peers' learning. In terms of the skin picking, we did notice that this was linked to environmental factors, and specifically when it was cold or wet and she had dry skin, she would engage in kind of picking of her skin and her lips. And we found that putting on some body lotion in the morning and putting on a lip balm removed this problem and didn't require any kind of further intervention. In terms of the picking of the object, she did engage in some flicking of kind of cardboard or books and that kind of thing, but again we decided this wasn't of a high enough priority at the moment to work on, and we'd just focus on the self-stimulation. As you can see, there's no phase line here unfortunately, but we started intervention at the beginning of September, and as you can see, baseline in comparison to the intervention, there is limited impact on our ability to actually decrease her engagement in self-stim. This data is taken here as a partial interval recording over I think a 30-minute period with a 1-minute partial interval for each interval. And you can see that she's still, even with the interventions we put in place, she's still engaging at really high rates of behaviour. So based on the data and the fact that we weren't having a significant impact on her behaviour, we decided we would take a functional assessment to determine or to check that we have the right function of the behaviour. And actually came out, we were quite surprised that the behaviour itself functions as escape. You can see here that across all 4 sessions, engagement in the behaviour during escape conditions was significantly higher than the other conditions. This was somewhat surprising to us because we'd always assumed that it was automatic reinforcement and that she had limited control over it, but this kind of displayed to us that actually she was able to control the behaviour, she was able to cease the behaviour. Specifically in the play and the alone conditions, there was very limited amounts of behaviour, suggesting that it was more under her control than we thought, and that therefore was something we could work on and we could change. So based on our functional assessment, we did make a few amendments to the intervention. We changed her functional communication phrase from "I need a break" to "I don't want to." We actually found in teaching the break for this specific child that she really didn't want a break. She's quite motivated by her token. She's very motivated to kind of complete her work and get things done and to gain access to tangible items and playtime. She didn't want to take a break because she knew that taking a break would prolong her access, or delay her access to getting those preferred items. And as a result, when you sent her for a break to go and engage in self-stim, she wasn't particularly happy with you. She wanted to come back to the desk and to continue working. So because of the ineffectiveness of this functional communication phrase, we changed the phrase to "I don't want to." Because we knew the behaviour functioned to escape, we wanted to allow her to say she didn't want to do that specific activity. So she was escaping the specific activity rather than escaping work in of itself. We taught initially erroneously, and every single request for "I don't want to" was honoured, and we would offer a different activity to do instead, and eventually faded it to the point where she could say "I don't want to" a couple of times, and then she was given a forced choice. So once she said "I don't want to" 3 different activities, she was given a forced choice of, okay, you have to do A or B, and then we would work through it. We also put in a continued demand procedure to ensure that the engagement in self-stimulation did not result in escape from the work. So when she engaged in the humming, we would continue the demand with least to most prompting to ensure that she followed through. She would continue to work and she wouldn't gain any reinforcement until she completed the tasks without engagement in self-stim. And we also put in a response cost. A response cost is something I am typically hesitant to put in. It's not something I've ever actually used in terms of self-stimulatory behaviour before, but because this little girl had such a great understanding of her token economy system, she was very motivated to earn her tokens and to get access to her tangible items and to go and play. We felt that the response cost and the loss of a token would have a significant impact on her behaviour, and we hoped it would quickly reduce her behaviour. So here you can see our follow-up data. We actually changed the data collection during our follow-up, so it's not a direct comparison, unfortunately. But the reason for changing our data was that we found during the partial interval, because of the high frequency in which she engaged in the behaviour, we were finding it very difficult to have a whole interval in which she was not engaging in the behaviour. And we were concerned that based on the overestimate of the behaviour frequency in the partial interval, that it would take a long time for the behaviour to reduce to a point where we actually see a difference in the data. So as a result, we changed our data collection to duration, and we did a 1 hour sample per day, looking at the cumulative duration of engagement in humming for that hour period. And you can see initially we're up around 35-40 minutes per hour, so she's engaging in the behaviour for at least 50% of her time. But as you can see, as the intervention progressed, we did see a really nice, pretty quick decrease in the challenging behaviour, round to a point of almost 0 by the end of it, which was really good to see. She was really responsive to the response cost. It only took a couple of times for her to access that contingency, for her to realise what was going on, and for her to be able to decrease her behaviour at the desk. It's important to point out that we were only focusing on her self-stimulation at the desk. She's allowed to engage in the humming and the self-stim as much as she wants during free play, but the rule is when she's at the desk or she's working with her peers that she's not engaging in that behaviour. So we move on now to case study number 2. This is a 9-year-old male. He is non-verbal, he has limited communication, and he uses a speech generating device. So his communication is very limited to a few single words for edible items and a few social activities such as tickles and play. The target behaviour we're looking at is movement and olfactory self-stims, and these include flicking your fingers, tapping fingers to hard surfaces, manipulation of objects, sniffing items, and mouthing of items. And the function of behaviour was automatic. So why we intervened? The reason for intervening on this one of the main reasons actually was the inclusion of mouthing within the definition of self-stim. We were somewhat concerned with some of the inedible items that he was placing in his mouth, and we're concerned that this posed a risk for his health and a choking hazard. This was one of the main reasons we decided it was important to intervene. Also, you can see that engagement in self-stimulation is really high. We did 5-minute intervals across 30 minutes of partial interval recording, and every single data point is above 70%. So his engagement in self-stimulation was dominating his day. He engaged in almost constant levels of self-stim, and this was disruptive to both his learning and his social interaction. And as a result, we decided it was important to intervene with. Again, this is a student that didn't have any other kind of significant overt challenging behaviours. There are no instances of aggression or self-injury or property destruction that warranted our attention, and as a result we felt the decrease in self-stimulation could have a meaningful impact on this child. So in terms of our intervention, we started again with a token economy for differential reinforcement of other behaviour. We started with just a single token and built our way up. He had to engage on a fixed ratio of 1. Every correct response without engagement in self-stim was given a token access to reinforcement. We also put in a functional communication for a break, so very similar to the previous case study we talked about. We set up a break area that he could make a request to go and access. It had in there all the kind of things he typically engaged in self-stim with, some puzzles, some hardback books, some kind of felt wall coverings, things that he typically used for self-stim. We did find actually for this intervention that it was really time consuming in terms of the redirection, because we had to have someone kind of observing him all the time. Every time he engaged in some kind of self-stim during play, he was brought back to the desk. He was given an incompatible task, and he was prompted to ask for a break to go to the break area. We also put in a sensory diet, so looking at some other ways that he could gain appropriate proprioceptive feedback. He really enjoys tickles and squeezes and pushing on the balls. We put in kind of communication requests for all of those and choice boards for all of those kind of things. And we put in a conditioning play drill because he has very limited play skills. And we felt that because pretty much all of his free time and playtime was engagement in self-stim, if we could teach him some more appropriate play skills, this would hopefully replace the behaviour. So in terms of our data, you can see that from baseline to intervention, we did see a decrease. Our baseline is averaging around 80% engagement in the target behaviour, and your intervention is averaging around 50%. So it was a good decrease. Most significantly, we saw a decrease in the mouthing. So in doing these interventions and providing the appropriate reinforcement for other behaviours, we did see a significant decrease in the mouthing, which was really good because this was the behaviour we were most concerned about in terms of his health and safety. However, we did feel that the intervention hadn't decreased the behaviour quite as far as we'd hoped. You can see there's still quite a high level of variance in terms of the engagement in the behaviour, and we were still unsure as to how much this was disrupting his learning and his ability to attend. So in considering our changes or amendments to the data procedure, we wanted to look at how much the behaviour was actually inhibiting his responding to instruction. We wanted to check how often his engagement in self-stim was actually stopping him from making a response to the instruction or the lesson at hand. So we took data using a time sample on the number of instructions he responded to within 3 seconds versus the number of instructions he didn't respond to. It's important to point out here that by responding, we're not looking for a correct response, but we're looking at him essentially ceasing his engagement in self-stim, orienting to the teacher, and making some kind of attempt at responding to the instruction that was given. So we weren't requiring a correct response, but we were requiring him to at least pay attention and join in. And as you can see, actually, it's a really high level of responding. It's, I think 83% was the average, which we were actually quite happy with. And this data suggested to us that perhaps engagement in self-stimulation wasn't inhibiting his learning at the desk as much as we thought it was. At the desk, he was capable of ceasing the self-stimulation, orienting to the teacher, and responding to the instruction, which was really good. So based on this data, we actually decided that reducing self-stimulation itself and continuing to focus on his target behaviour was not necessary. We would instead work on increasing his duration of time at the desk, improving his group skills, improving his social skills, and improving his play skills. And it was hoped that by improving all of these skill sets that we would naturally see a decrease in the inappropriate self-stimulation, but we weren't necessarily specifically targeting self-stimulation in of itself. So based on this new data, we made a few changes to his intervention. We actually removed his token economy for a few reasons, but the main one being that he didn't have a true comprehension of what the actual token economy meant. He didn't seem to really understand what he was earning tokens for, what he had to do to earn a token, why he didn't earn a token. He didn't seem to understand that once you've got all your tokens, you exchange them for a preferred item. And based on this, we felt the token economy itself was having limited impact on improving his appropriate behaviour. So instead, we moved to a simple first then, whereby he would sit at the desk and participate for a set time period, and then he'd get to go and play and engage in preferred activities. During this time, he can obviously make requests for preferred activities, and these are granted intermittently. And he's also on a fixed ratio of 1 for correct responding to target items. This included tickles, squeezes, high fives, social praise, and edible items. And we did continue the conditioned play drill because we felt this was important to him in terms of his ability to interact and engage. Mum had reported at home that he was really difficult to entertain at home. He didn't entertain his own time particularly well and didn't fill his leisure time with appropriate activities. So we felt this was still a really important skill to work on for him. So in terms of our follow-up data, we ceased taking data on self-stimulation because it was no longer a target behaviour or something we were actually actively working to decrease. We stopped doing our partial interval recording, but we did continue to take our percentage of responses within the 3-second time frame just to ensure that our interventions or changes to interventions maintained his level of responding. And as you can see from the data, it did. His level of responding maintained at around the 80%, and it was good to see that this level of responding maintained even as we increased the expectation. So we started with our first then on a fixed interval of 3 minutes, and we're at the point now where he's working for 6 minutes at the desk before he gains access to reinforcement. And he can maintain his appropriate behaviour and still respond 80% of the time during this 6-minute time frame. So that was really good. Based on the fact that he is able to cease his engagement in the target behaviour and respond to the instruction, although the behaviour, the self-stim, does still occur at high frequencies, it's not impacting his learning, it's not impacting his group participation, and he is making good progress through his skill sets. So finally, we're going to talk about case study 3. This is a 9-year-old male. He is verbal. He is able to make 2 to 3 word spoken requests. And the target behaviour we were looking at for him was movement and visual self-stim. These included finger flicking, rigid body movements, vocal squealing, fidgeting, wiggling his legs, tapping his feet, and manipulation of stimuli. And the function of this behaviour was deemed to be automatic. I think what's interesting to note about this definition here is actually when we started taking data on self-stim, it really just included finger flicking and the rigid body movements, but as we started to intervene on these behaviours and stopped him from engaging in these behaviours, he actually change the topography of his behaviour, looking more at fidgeting, wriggling his legs, tapping his feet. So we had to kind of extend the definition of what we were working on to include some of these new behaviours that he started to engage in. So in terms of intervention for him, this is a really bright little guy, and we felt sure that his learning was being inhibited by his engagement in self-stimulation, and we were also pretty sure that if we could decrease the level of self-stim he engaged in, we could actually increase his learning and acquisition rate. As you can see from the data here, the engagement, or the percentage of intervals in which he engaged in the behaviour, you're averaging at around 65–70%. But what was most important to us was the acquisition rate for this student at this time was typically about 25 sessions per target to learn a new skill. And we really felt, based on his skill set and based on the style in which he learned, he should be capable of learning and acquiring new targets at a much quicker rate. Again, this is an example of a student who has limited other overt behaviours. So again, there's no instances of aggression or physical contact or self-injury. Doesn't pose a risk of self to others, but it was a significant impact on his social interaction and learning, and as such we decided it was important to intervene on. So in terms of our intervention for this little guy, we actually started by removing all of his academic programming and focusing just on behaviour intervention for a 10-week period. The reason for doing this is that we felt that because learning new skills was somewhat difficult for him, it was taking him a while to acquire new skills, and we knew that ceasing the target behaviour or ceasing self-stim was going to be hard for him. We didn't want to work on both skill sets at once. So by reducing the demand and removing the expectation to learn new skills, this allowed us to really focus on the behaviour itself and to focus on decreasing it and reinforcing appropriate behaviours. We put in a differential reinforcement of other behaviour and started with a simple first send for him. We simply required him to complete 2 master responses without self-stim, and then his access to reinforcement often included self-stim of itself. So he would often choose preferred activity or preferred item. This time it was watching Coke cans on YouTube, but he would engage in that behaviour along with self-stim, and that was fine. We allowed him contingent access to self-stim during his play and free times, but he wasn't allowed to engage in self-stim during the actual work task. We gradually increased the expectation, and we included in visuals for him to demonstrate the response cost. So initially it was an all or nothing for him. He had to complete the 2 consecutive responses without self-stim, and if he engaged in self-stim, it restarted and he had to complete 2 additional responses before he was able to gain access to reinforcement. We had a visual to show him this that showed he was working towards a specific item. We actually ended up giving him pictures of the item he was working for and cutting them into puzzle pieces. So if he was working for iPad, for each correct response he would get one half of the iPad picture and the second half of the iPad picture, and if he engaged in self-stim, both halves of the picture were removed and he had to start the whole process again. We moved this up to 3 responses, 4 responses, 5 responses, up until the point where he was working for 10 consecutive responses without before gaining access to the reinforcement. And still at this point it was an all or nothing principle, whereby he had to complete all 10 responses consecutively. If he engaged in self-stim at response number 8, he lost all of those and had to go back to the start again. We also put in for him some sensory breaks, so access to preferred items and activities that he can engage in the self-stim with. He really liked the kind of physical activities, so we found taking him outside, getting him to run around, getting him to kind of, engage in those behaviours outside really helped him focus and attend at the desk. Again, he was one that we did put a response cost in right from the start, partly due to the success we had with case study 1, and also because we felt with him that he had the comprehension and the understanding of the token economy system and the understanding of the kind of contingent that was in place, and we felt that it would be motivating to him to know that if he engaged in the appropriate behaviours without the targets, he wouldn't result in response cost. And it did very quickly. He very quickly learned that if he just engaged in the appropriate behaviour, he wouldn't get a response cost and he'd get access to his preferred item much quicker. And you can see here a review of our data. This was a really successful intervention. We were really pleased with how quickly the frequency of his behaviour decreased from an average of up around 70% down to 20% after only 90 sessions. So this was, we're really pleased with this data. He showed a consistent decrease in the level of self-stim. And it's important to remember that during this passage of time we've increased the expectation on him. So when you're looking at your 70% engagement at the start, he was only required to complete 2 responses prior to gaining access to reinforcement, but by the time you get to the end with your 20% engagement, he's actually completing 10 consecutive responses without target behaviour to gain access to reinforcement at this point. So based on the success of this, we didn't need to do any kind of reanalysis or any changes to our procedures. They worked as we'd hoped, but our next steps were to reintroduce the token economy, to reintroduce his academic programming, to put in some conditioning play, and to continue the previous interventions we had in place. So once the token economy was in place, the response cost changed. So rather than being an all or nothing principle like it was in the first then, the response cost constitutes the loss of a single token. We moved into a variable ratio of 2 rather than a fixed ratio of 1, and we monitored his behaviour during this time to ensure we didn't see an increase. The behaviour maintained at this level with the token economy, and based on the maintenance of the behaviour, we then started to gradually reintroduce his content drills. We started by introducing drills that we knew were concepts he found slightly easier, and held off introducing the more difficult tasks further on until later on. Again, we continued to monitor his behaviour during this time and to ensure we didn't see an increase in the target behaviour. As his behaviour maintained and he continued to learn the new academic programming, we increased the expectations and increased the response. We also continued with our functional communication training. The sensory breaks and response costs had been done previously, with the addition of the play drill to teach him some more appropriate play skills and more appropriate interactions with peers. We actually put in some nice social play drills for him because he was starting to show an interest in his peers and participating in a group. We saw this as a nice opportunity to teach some nice social skills for him and join him in. I think it's important to discuss at this point the difference between the 3 case studies and the use of the response cost. Across the 3 case studies, the first response cost was used for case study 1 because the target behaviour functioned to escape work. So we knew that by using the response cost, we would increase the amount of time she spent in work. Therefore, the motivation was to not engage in the behaviour to avoid increasing time at work. For the second case study, we didn't use response cost. We didn't feel this little guy had the appropriate level of understanding in terms of his token economy and the contingencies in place, and didn't think it would be an effective punishment for him. And then for this case study here, we used the response cost because the response cost itself resulted in delayed access to reinforcement. So whereas in case study 1 the response cost resulted in increased work expectations because the behaviour functioned for escape, in case study 3 the response cost functioned for prolonged or delayed access to reinforcement because the reinforcement in this case was access to the self-stim and the automatic activity. So you can see here a review of data. Again, we changed our data from a partial interval to a 30-minute sample. Once we got to the point where the partial intervals were around 10-20%, we felt that this again wasn't giving us a true representation of the target behaviour and how often it was happening. So we moved this to a duration of self-stim during a 30-minute sample. And you can see, with the exception of that one outlier, he's really below 3 minutes within a 30-minute interval. So that's really low levels of self-stim. And at this point his target behaviours are back in place, his academic skills are back in place, and his acquisition of target behaviours or new skills had actually decreased from its 25 sessions in the baseline, and it's now taking between 8 and 9 sessions to learn a brand new skill. So that's almost doubled his learning and doubled his acquisition rate by decreasing the level of self-stim. Again, as with participant 1 in these case studies, we're not working on decreasing his self-stim during playtime. He has free access to self-stim during the playtimes, but the expectation is he doesn't engage in the behaviour at the desk. A future step for this little guy might be, once he's got some more appropriate play skills, that we start to further reduce the level of self-stim he engages in during play so that we can gradually decrease it across the day. So in summary, when you're intervening with self-stimulatory behaviours, it's really, really important to consider the function. As you can see from case study 1 that we talked about earlier, we made the incorrect assumption that the behaviour functioned for automatic, and as a result our intervention wasn't effective. Once we'd looked at the actual function and changed our intervention based on this, we were able to successfully decrease the challenging behaviour. Intervention on self-stimulatory behaviour is controversial and has historically been an area which is difficult to intervene on, and often is difficult to intervene on successfully. It's something that personally, until I did this research and did these few case studies, I hadn't had much success in terms of actually decreasing self-stimulatory behaviour to a level that was socially significant for the individual. So it is important to consider your priorities, consider what's important when you're intervening, and ensure the intervention you're putting in place has a meaningful impact for the student. But I hope that you'll see from the case studies we talked about that it is possible to put some simple proactive and reactive strategies in place, and that self-stimulation can be decreased to a level where the individual is able to participate more appropriately in activities, both in work and play. So that's it for today. Here is the reference to the journal article I talked about at the beginning, and also there's a YouTube reference there for a podcast by Greg Hanley on the intervention to self-stimulatory behaviour, which I found really interesting in doing this research. My email address is there. If you have any questions, comments, etc., please feel free to send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. For those of you who purchased the option for the continuing education credits as a BACB, this training does give you 1 continuing education credit. If you could please email me with the proof of receipt, the certificate of attendance, and there is a short questionnaire to answer to ensure that you paid attention for the whole time, and then I can give you a certificate for your participation. Thank you very much for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day.